But my name is Dr. Cami Fletcher. I'm a historian at Albright College in Pennsylvania and in the US, really close to Washington, D.C. And so my work, I examine African American death ways and death work. I have been researching for over 10 years the first autonomously Black cemetery in Baltimore, and how these folks that were freed, they were also enslaved, how they used death, how they used death work to resist slavery, to resist the plantation complex, to resist racism, to establish citizenship rights, to establish burial rights, to establish generational wealth building. Again, this is about decolonizing death studies. What does that mean? That means decentering whiteness. In the US, and I would argue throughout the world, honestly, this idea of death has just collapsed as Europeans went out and colonized, right? Their norms, their culture, their way of life, their language, their dress, all of that became the norm, also death as well. So there's a serious idea of decentering whiteness. And then there's also a seriousness of placing death ways and death work of Black, Indigenous, people of color at the center. So that is absolutely where you start. Here in the US, there is this idea that death is the great equalizer, and people swallow it up whole. We may have systems of oppression in life, but in death, everybody dies. So death is the great equalizer, right? And nothing could be further from the truth when we talk about the way in which people die. The institution of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade. Maurice Jackson, who I'll quote him on the next slide, says, all people die, but do not all people die alike. He talks about the slave trade. He talks about the institutions in which Black folks are dying, genocide, the plantation complex, lynching, government sanctioned violence, the Tuskegee experiment. Those are unnatural deaths, right? So we have to look at how colonialism, we have to look at how these systems of oppression are providing people of color. And my research deals specifically on Black people, that these are unnatural deaths, right? So then why is death so white? Deathways and death work has been associated with Europe, European descendants, and it has focused on them, especially when we look at cemeteries. And a lot of my research focuses on this because the cemetery is where we remember ourselves. And us here in the US, we got our ideas for this rural garden, 100-acre cemetery, right, from Europe. And this is how we choose to remember ourselves. We don't want to remember the Native American cemeteries because our field of archaeology has been built on that, where we can go out and we can just dig up these Native American relics, put them in museums without anybody's consent, right? Slave cemeteries, places where free Blacks were buried. I'll talk about that probably later on, where they've been paved over due to urban development. Condos are built on top of those, right? The places we want to remember are really in New England, the first kind of 13 colonies, if you get a little history here. So we have to decenter this and say, okay, whose memory are we remembering? Whose memory has really been ensconced in the American identity, and who has been excluded, right? So that's how death has really gotten so white. And again, death ways and death work has been about marginalizing, dismissing, and just completely misunderstood. Very early on, the National Funeral Directors Association, that was started late 19th century here, early on it was segregated. So much so that the National Association for Funeral Morticians had to organize themselves. That was the Black organization. So death early in this country, death work as an industry has been segregated, right? And in our country here, we talk about that there's this death phobia here. Americans are afraid of death. And the support for that is that death used to be in the home and folks took care of it in the home. But once hospitals were established, we pushed death the same way we push cemeteries out of our city center. We push death from our home to the hospital. That was Jim Crow segregation. Black folks weren't even allowed into the cemetery. Again, so we have to find out what's going on here. So it's just one layer, and we are really talking about anti-racism work. Women and end of life. Now, women here have really been taking up a central role in death, which is important. But again, these are white women. When you look at the death doula movement, and they're doing some very important work to push back against the death industry. But again, these are white women that are centering themselves as doulas. And one of the things that's very problematic about that is that they are saying that historically, this has been the role of women. And I'm saying, as a historian, this has been the role of poor women, of women of color. Very similar to the way in which women of color and poor women have historically been nurses, have historically nursed babies, and have historically been these helpmates. So again, they're centering themselves in a narrative that they never were in. Making important strides, but it's important to find your place in that, right? So my group and I, the Collective for Radical Death Studies, this was started in December 2018, and it was exactly, what I just talked about. It was a call to decolonize death studies, and that's really what I want to talk with you about. So I'm the president of the Collective for Radical Death Studies. Please feel free to follow me on Twitter at Cami Fletcher 36. I'm very active there in my intellectual pursuits, my academic career as a death scholar and a historian. Please feel free to email me at Cami@radicaldeathstudies.com.
Why is it important for us to do a similar thing in the UK?
It's again, the binding theme is colonization, right? So we are all in the diaspora. And there's a serious social erasure that happens with deathways. And it does a thing of where it's trying to help us. Oh, we're all the same. We don't want to have these divides. They do that with us in the US. Why do you have a historically Black college? Why do you have these spaces where Black folks gather? First of all, to protect ourselves from whiteness and racism, right? And so death is the same way too. To know your death ways is to know your history. And I got in a little bit on what the last presenter was talking about, to erase how we prepare and how we prepare the body, the meaning around the body, the meaning around our burial spaces, honestly, is to erase us as Black folks. Our saving grace, which was also so dehumanizing, was Jim Crow segregation for us here in the States. One of the reasons why you can look at a homegoing celebration now, if you saw George Floyd's funeral, that homegoing celebration mirrors what happened in 1910, 1890 here, because white folks very early on separated themselves from us. So the death industry, they left us to ourselves. You know what I'm saying? So we were able to protect and hold on to stuff that our ancestors, trying to hold on to something from Africa, was able to pass down to us. It's history. It is history. Turning that mirror around, putting the cloth over the clock, over the mirror, over the clock, stopping the clock, all of the grave goods, all of that stuff helps connect us back to who we are. It's the same thing as us losing our name, right? Losing our clothes, our dress, our language. We in the US are really struggling to find that here. And we've been on a real quest, of course, for forever. But I think with the publication of Roots by Alex Haley in 1970s was that. But again, it's important because it is, you really do lose your history. And then there's this idea of you just kind of latching on to what the colonizer does. And I'm not going to say that nothing's necessarily wrong with that, because of course, if you look at what we've done here in the US, a lot of death material culture, there's a negotiation there. And that nothing absolutely is wrong with that. We all negotiate, but to just lose it really can be to just lose your history.
But there may be some people, Dr. Cami, that would say, look, okay, we're talking about, the 1940s, 1920s, why can't we all just get along and live in love, peace, and harmony, why do we continue to pull back Black people back to the 1960s, to the 1950s? Can't we, now that we're in a more kind of liberal society, can't we just naturally integrate and just get on with it? What would your response be to that?
Our society doesn't want us. They want us to acculturate, perm my hair, not be threatening, wear a suit, smile all day. But we are not truly assimilated until the society accept us, right? And this is why Black folks are still being killed, right? At alarming rates. Black women are still being victimized at alarming rates, raped, killed, right? We're talking about systemic. We're not talking about our happy white neighbor next door. This is systemic in the ways in which Black folks are dying. That shows you. COVID, for example, was just hitting Black communities like a bomb. And us over here, we're all watching the news. We're slow. The news networks were slow to pick up on this. I remember there was a news article. Out of 14 people at that time, somewhere around April 2020, every person that had died of COVID was Black. Every single person. Right. And so this is not about how do we get along. We cannot be naive to that type of, what is it? Colorblind racism is what it is. Because it just negates the system. And I'm not being pulled back to the 60s. The 60s is pulling me back. The racism is absolutely, you know what I mean, still there. And George Floyd's murder, Breonna Taylor's murder, these things that Black folks in the US specifically, have been fighting against for years. Racism reinvents itself. Michelle Alexander has a wonderful book, The New Jim Crow, and how it continues to reinvent itself. And this kind of colorblind racism moment is what we're living in now. Lots of upwardly mobile Black folks, right? But still, there is a system to try to keep us in check and keep us in place. And you can look at our death waves. And one more thing I'll just add to that, Miss Lola, is as I do research on Jim Crow cemeteries, again, when Jim Crow was enacted here saying that public is now the domain of white people, the library where we live, everywhere, 1896. In January of this year, this man who was of color in Louisiana, he died. His wife went to try to get him a burial space. And the people there told him, no, we do not sell to Negroes, or I think they use the word Black people. 2021, January 2021. So this is what I'm saying. We're still in this until these systems that colonialism has so just concretized, until we have to uproot these systems, they've got to come crumbling down.
Another question for you is, even within the Black industry themselves, D stands for everything apart from death and dying. There's a lot of suspicion about death and dying. And that's probably the reason why, white folks, so to speak, have been able to take control over it. What would you say to us? Can you address us specifically about what we need to do and the types of education that we absolutely need to understand?
So interesting. The last presenter was talking about co-ops are buying up these funeral homes. It is the death industry is a $1 billion industry here. We have a very similar thing. SCI, I think, is the name of it. And this may be happening over there. You all can let me know. Is that funeral homes are really a family business here. And so now when the owners are retiring or they die out, the children don't necessarily want to go into the work. These cemetery corporations that are absolutely white owned come right in, swoop it up, and they keep all the Black employers, they keep the name. So you think you're going to a Black funeral home, but you're going to SCI. And they've been doing this, right? They've been doing this since it started with the American Association of Cemetery Superintendents that, again, was segregated, 1887. So I think if we're talking dollars and cents, we're talking dollars and cents. You need to understand who's owning it, who's controlling it. And I see nothing wrong with organizing. And let me know if I'm not hearing your question about there is suspicion around death and dying. But the way I'm hearing it is folks don't want to be involved in okay, you don't want to be involved in you don't want to be a mortuary person, you don't want to be a funeral director or own anything like that. You've already given up control to folks um, that, if I'm again hearing you right, that is something that is still very sacred.
Yes.
There's a lot of different research here in the States and possibly here in where you are around younger people. Black folks don't all live together, so we're dispersed. I mean, even in the US, and I'm sure even in London, and so we just want the better deal. But there's still this idea of making sure, and the last presenter was just saying it, that I look like my person looks like themselves in death. The hair is together, the makeup is together, the nails are together. If you don't have a hand in that, you've already lost, right? So I can't tell you to go be, a mortician. I myself am not a mortician. I'm a historian. I'm very involved in telling the story. That's my thing. That's why I got into this. I'm sick of white folks trying to tell our story in a white savior type complex. Not every white person is doing this, right? We've got to get that out there. But if you're not involved in it, then how can you have a say? And I think that's where FACFO is coming in to try to educate folks in these gaps of repatriation is very real in London. And so if you have someone that can be educated around the legal ramifications, my good friend that's in Uganda that led our Rad Death Reads was talking about that. You need somebody that understands that visa process. You need somebody that understands that red tape, the bureaucracy, and be able to understand these things. And if you don't, then how is repatriation that's so very critical to many communities where you are, how is that going to happen? So I guess that's what I'm saying. You have to get involved in it, or you're going to be left to not have a say.
Absolutely. And, we do know that you've very graciously given us of your time this afternoon and that you do have to go. But are there any final thoughts that you would like to leave with all of us that are here this afternoon?
I just keep doing what you're doing. Keep organizing. It doesn't have to be a big thing. The Black Cemetery collection that I'm a part of is really grassroots. These are folks that are there's a cemetery that I know of that has Black folks buried in it. We're not even related by blood, but I can't believe that it is in ruins like this. And this is folks that just started asking questions, kept digging, pulled out some time and just started to organize. Keep organizing, keep asking questions, understand you're going up against a system. And that's kind of what we found ourselves with. But we were able to gain momentum and have folks that are in the legislature come talk with us, see our needs and what we have going on. And I encourage you to do the same thing as well. But the death industry, again, is a $1 billion business. They have a lot to lose if you start hitting them in the pocket. And that is just the honest to goodness truth. But keep doing what you're doing and find people that are doing what you're doing and organizing. You are so, you were just better in numbers, better in numbers. So keep doing what you're doing. I'm so excited to have come here and be a part of it. And please feel free to reach out to me.
And my final question before we let you go, we understand that there's a trip coming up. Do you have a trip coming up? Is it next year? And can you tell us a bit about that? And is it open to all? Is it a small group? And yes.
No, I would love to do that. And that's out of our education and outreach. We really believe in doing that. So we are going to Ghana um, June 16th, I think, through, or the, yeah, 16th through the 26th, or 17th through the 27th. And it is open to everyone. Unfortunately, we've reached our max. We just really capped out. Folks were really excited about this for 2022. We hope to do it again in 2023. And that's one of those things where we're not going to Ghana to do service learning and tell these people what they're doing. We're going to listen. We're going to listen. We're going to learn from some of the oldest folks to have done death work. You all may be familiar with fantasy coffins. And again, this is how we are decolonizing and decentering the narrative. And again, we're learning from the people who are in mortuary science, who do traditional ways of learning in Ghana, Accra, that region where we will be in. We know that funerals happen on the weekend, and really just trying to learn from these folks, right? And just soak everything that we can up, but also not to take as our own. That's something that folks here in the U.S. Need to stop. There's a whole thing in the U.S. with white folks saying, "Oh, death isn't scary anymore," and they're attaching themselves to Dia de los Muertos, and sugar skulls are everywhere. That's not your culture. You can't just take people's code, what the parts you like of it. So hopefully this trip is that as well. I'm hoping that this can happen every year, and we go to places like Egypt, go to Uganda, and places in South America where we again are doing this decolonial work, where we're understanding colonization, understanding how folks have remade these rituals, things that they've been able to hold on to. I'm a big proponent of not being voyeuristic. So, what is the US's relationship to this country? How have they affected death and death ways that, an imperialistic or colonization standpoint?